Luis, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate you having me. I feel honored and very, very grateful.
Luis, you faced immense physical and personal challenges from surviving a brain tumor, multiple operations, to completing grueling endurance events in over 100 marathons. How has your journey through these experiences shaped your understanding of resilience and joy?
Let's talk about resilience first, if it
Mhm.
is okay with you. I think that for me, yes, I have survived a brain tumor. I think that I have run over 100 marathons, several ultra marathons, 100-mile races, done several Ironman triathlons too. But looking back, I realized that I didn't wake up one day and I said, I'm going to run 100 miles today. That it took time for me to, to most importantly, to make the decision and then start training. And just like when I was going through the brain tumor as well, and I didn't have a choice about having the tumor. But then I realized that it is within my choice to do something about it. So I remember, one of the lowest points of my life, I literally woke up and said, I'm making a decision. My decision is I'm gonna get better. I need to get better. And from that moment on, I started to doing things that will actually make me feel better and make me better. So resilience, I think that is a process of adaptation. We adapt, and but it starts with making a commitment. So that's number one. How does that connect to joy? Just before we got in, recording, we're talking about the difference between happiness and joy. And the way I see it, I feel the happiness it has an outside source. I'm happy with my job. I'm happy with my family. I'm happy with this. I'm happy with that. And joy is more internal. And so I think that finding joy is doing something that gives you a level of fulfillment or meaning. And that is absolutely an internal component of it.
In your latest book, you actually have developed a unique equation for resilience: optimism times commitment plus persistence, right?
Yes.
Can you explain how you developed this formula and what makes optimism such a crucial multiplier in building resilience?
Yeah. So going back a little bit about talking about resilience. First of all, I think that resilience has been traditionally equated to big feats. Like a person that climbed the Everest, or a person that survived a war, or a person that survived a brain tumor like myself. And the book I claim that the resilience is already ingrained within ourselves. Everybody has access to it. We are the most dominant species in the world because we are resilient and because we have gone through a process of adaptation.
Mhm.
So the way I describe resilience is that it is already within us. And what I have found is my experience over time is that it always starts with making a commitment. I remember growing up, when I didn't like something, my dad would ask me, so what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? And so it starts with commitment. Like, I am going to make a commitment to get better. If I don't like something, I'm going to make a commitment to do something about it. And I choose commitment because as opposed to a decision, because I think that decision is more cerebral and commitment is from the heart. You need some emotional connection to whatever you want to do. So that's number one, committed. The second component is persistence. And, Andrea, you and I were talking about this earlier, that life is hard. Life is really hard. And I think that, a lot of times, we tend to solve for comfort. We tend to solve for comfort, and then sometimes we confuse being uncomfortable with what is called being painful. I don't want to talk to my boss because it's painful. No, that is not painful. It's uncomfortable. I don't want to do that because it's painful. I don't want to run because it's painful. No, it's not painful. It's uncomfortable. So I think that for me, persistence is doing the uncomfortable because you have committed to something bigger than yourself. Now, if you think about that, if you have only commitment, and some people are committed to the work, which is fine, and they're persistent to the work, but that is a recipe for burnout. Why optimism is a multiplier? Because the bad things that are happening to us right now are temporary. By being optimistic about the future and by seeing the possibilities, that gives me a direction to go through. understanding that this moment that I'm having is not going to last forever. And that's what I put it as a multiplier, because when in terms of resilience, when there is no optimism, when there is no hope, there is zero resilience.
When we talk about resilience, it's not just about surviving, but adversity, but it's also rather about thriving because of it. And I'm curious to know what steps you took after your brain operation to thrive amidst that adversity.
The simple answer is being present. Is like, I don't like my situation. And tomorrow, well, I am where I am now, but I'm farther ahead from where I was before. So if you think of the way people see resilience, if you remember, the classical definition of resilience is bouncing back. They're bouncing back and returning to the same state that it was before. And I realized personally is that I could never go back to the same state that I was before, because that person didn't exist anymore. So when I went through the operations, and I lost my ability to think clearly, my short-term memory was impaired, I couldn't go back to work as a professor, I realized that that person that I was so proud of didn't exist anymore. The issue with that is that I was equating what I do with who I was, and I thought that I was a professor, and that was something that started putting a lot of questions about my worthiness. But once I realized that who I am is not what I do, and that is the person that was before didn't exist anymore, then I could move forward.
I love that. And what you're sharing resonates with me so much, particularly because when I had my own brain surgery, and when they were telling me the process that I was going to go through, one of them, of course, shaving part of my head here in the back, I felt as if a part of my identity was crumbling down. I had just launched a startup that was doing very well. I had brought in actually even two investors. And while I was going through this and I shared what was happening with my two business partners and investors, I almost wanted to keep it a secret. I didn't want to tell anyone what I was going through, because I wanted to protect that image. Crazy enough that I've been able now to totally let go. And in fact, it's almost as if there's the Andrea before the operation and the Andrea after the operation. I was curious if you feel in a similar way as a result of our shared experiences.
Yes, to your point, because to me it's a point of shame. It was shameful not to be able to do the things that I used to do before. Especially people that didn't know me before. Yeah, and then, oh my gosh, who is he? Yeah, and then yes, it was a lot of shame on doing that. I think that the issue for me, and what worked for me, is to look forward to the future. What am I going to do now? What is it that I want? How I'm going to get where I want to get, given what I have. And the reality is that we already have everything that we need in order to move forward.
You mentioned earlier the advice that your father was giving. I was wondering if you can share with us your upbringing and how that has shaped your view on life and on joy.
So I grew up in Guatemala, Central America, at a time where there was a lot of political instability and violence. I also grew up really, really, really poor. Really poor. And, sometimes we wouldn't ask ourselves, what are we having for breakfast? But rather, are we having breakfast today? But I remember, despite everything that we were going through, as kids, as a family, I really had a happy childhood. And then I realized that one of the things that I did when I was growing up is that I used to reframe things easily. And I give you an example. My dad was a truck driver. And as a truck driver, he will go on the road for 2-3 days at a time. And I grew up very close to my dad. So when I was a small kid, we will play a game about hide and seek. And then he say, okay, it's time to play hide and seek. And, he will go hide, and I will go start looking for him. But in reality, he was actually leaving for his trips for 2-3 days at a time. But here is the funny thing, Andrea, is that I will keep looking for him. Sometimes I'll wake up the next day and I will looking for him, and I will looking for him. The reason why I'm saying this is because in my mind, I knew that he was gone. So reframing that was a coping mechanism for me. So I reframe things. And as I grew up, I realized that that's what I do now. I reframe things. And in my coaching practice, that's what I do. I help people to reframe the important moments so they can adapt and thrive, or we can adapt and thrive. So going back to what you say, what did I do? How my childhood shaped the way I am now. And I think that it completely shaped everything, especially about my superpower of reframing things and helping people to see the possibilities. So going back to the purpose of being joyful and happy, I think that a lot of times joy comes from the ability to do what we want to do. And I feel that a lot of times people feel that they have no choice until they can start exploring the possibilities.
Talking about reframing, I want to go back to the title of your book, Ordinary Resilience. The term ordinary makes it accessible to everyone. It really allows us to reframe our perspective on resilience. And just by reading the title of your book, in my mind, says, it's available for everyone. It's not restricted to these individuals and not these other individuals and so on. And I was wondering if you can share with us how you came up with that title, and maybe as well certain tips or insights on how people can start building their resilience today, particularly if they're struggling.
Yeah. So the book didn't start as a book. When I started, I like to write, and I like to journal. Going back to my childhood, also my dad had an accident, a horrible, horrible accident. And as I mentioned earlier, he was very poor. We were very poor. And when he came back, when he was in his recovery bed, he made a decision, and he said, I'm going to send you to the university. I'm going to build a house. I am going to build a business. And my mom and I were thinking, how are you going to do that? You couldn't do it when you were healthy. How are you going to do that? But guess what? He did it. He became a very successful businessman in my hometown. And when I was going through the same thing here, I had inspiration from him, but I also made a decision, and I said, I'm going to get better. I'm going to get better. And I look back at all the things that I've done, and I think that the people that knew me, they were saying, oh my God, how do you do that? You've done so much. You've done this, you do that. And in my mind, I was thinking, I am not doing anything special. I literally not doing anything special. I'm not going there thinking I'm going to be resilient. I'm just living the way I live. So the book started as a attempt to understand what is it that my dad and I do did that allow us to get where we are. And then I realized that the things that I and my dad did are accessible to everyone, everyone. And going back to why ordinary, because we already are resilient. We as the humans are the most dominant species in the world. Because we're resilient. And because we went through a process of adaptation, and that's what it is. Resilience is a process of adaptation. So that's what I call ordinary resilience, because we already have it. What we need to do is to unlock it.
Luis, since you've developed a formula for resilience, what would be your formula for joy?
So let's explore what joy does to me. And for me, joy gives me an inner peace, but also gives me a level of drive to keep going. But I think that joy also, what else? I'm thinking, what else is joy for me? I think that I find the most joy when I am doing something that is meaningful. So my formula for joy will be something about, purpose, significance, and maybe persistence. Persistence because it's not easy. Significance because I think that we can be significant in everything. We need to be significant to people. We need to find significance in what we do. We need to be significant for ourselves. And then purpose, making the realization that what we do has to have a higher purpose. It's not just about ourselves, but why are we put in this earth?
What is your purpose?
The reason for my existence is exactly the same thing as I mentioned earlier about reframing. I think that I read this book, Start With Why, by Simon Sinek.
Yes.
And I decided I need to find my why. And then, I tried to do it on my own. I couldn't do it. I finally hired a consultant. And here is my why: to reframe the important moments so we can adapt and thrive. That's my purpose. I help people reframe things. I help my coaches reframe things so they can see the possibilities. And that's how I live my life. Whenever something I don't like, how can I reframe it so I can look at it from a different perspective? My latest reframe, I remember when my kids were tiny, and my wife and I, were like changing diapers, and that's something that we didn't like to do. I didn't like to do, change diapers. And then I really realized that many particular fathers don't have the opportunity to do that because they're working all the time, just like my dad. And then I realized, wow, that's a privilege now to change diapers. So then that's what I do now. Is when I don't like something, I look at it from a different perspective, and then it gives me a different point of view. I open the refrigerator, I say, oh my God, there is nothing to eat here. But then I realize that there's a lot of people that don't have what I have. Then it makes me realize things completely different. And I think that that's what I do with my coaches, is to help them to see things from a different perspective, to reframe things. So that's what I think. That's what I do with my kids too. So that's my way of life, but also what you mentioned is my purpose.
And talking about the high performance leaders that you often coach, I also know that you write for HBR. In your view, where does joy fit within organizations?
I think that I always go back to the idea of being fulfilled versus being satisfied, almost a parallel to being happy versus being joyful. Satisfaction and happiness have an outside, it's basically extrinsic motivation, and fulfillment and joy are intrinsic. And I think that what happens is that a lot of times organizations are no fault, organizations focus on the extrinsic, more profit, more sales or whatever. The issue that I find is that the people that run those organizations also look for satisfaction when they should be looking for fulfillment. And what I mean by fulfillment is making things better for their employees, for their clients, or for someone else like that. The outcome is the satisfaction, but I think that the driver should be fulfillment.
Since you've worked extensively across cultures and industries, how do you see joy being expressed differently around the world? And are there any universal principles that you have discovered along the way?
I think that let me think this for a minute. Let's see how I think that I know the answer, but I'm trying to figure out how can I say it. I think that so my niche, I work with highly productive and impactful leaders. Sometimes organizations cannot afford to lose them. Literally, they cannot afford to lose them, but they're difficult to work with. Or they are micromanagers. They're putting the organization at legal peril. What I realize is, perhaps it's the first thing that I'm going to mention, is that 99% of us don't wake up in the morning and make a declaration and say, I'm going to be difficult today. So a lot of times, our intention doesn't translate into the impact that we want to have. And in order for us to realize what is the impact that we're having, we need to be very key to asking for feedback, to asking for people, because we need others to know ourselves. So now, what is a universal learnings? I think that we all want to have influence and power. I think that we all want to have that, and we're all afraid of losing face. Everyone that I know is afraid of losing face, and we don't do things because we're afraid of losing face, and we do things because we want to attain, power and influence. The key here for me is to understand that in order to do that, we need to be kinder to each other. We need to make sure that we are living a life that is driven by fulfillment and purpose. And those things become less and less relevant.
How do you help individuals overcome fear?
Just the way I have overcome fear of change. And I think that a lot of times change is scary because it puts us out of our comfort zone. I think that we don't need to find a way to be fearless, but to fear less. So what I mean by that is a lot of times, we are afraid of changing because that puts us out of our comfort zone. And going back to what resilience is a process of adaptation. You don't need to step out of our comfort zone. We need to expand our comfort zone. So we need to just take a little bit of a risk every time as we move forward and forward. We are, over time, we will take change. We will accept change and we will go with it. The fear will never disappear. What we need to do is try to, how can we minimize it? And how can we use fear as a source for taking risk? So it's not about being fearless, but fear a little bit less. I was reading an article earlier today about the difference between, they say that the world doesn't belong to the people that know the most, but the people that learn the fastest. A learning mentality can increase tremendously our joy, because I'm learning something new today, and that for me is joyful.
When you're looking at some of the global research studies that indicate the low level of employee engagement and employees thriving, why do you believe there is such a low level of engagement of employees within organizations globally?
I have a problem with the term employee engagement and how is being measured. In my previous life, I worked with an organization that actually did that, is measure employee engagement to organizations and then finding consulting opportunities from the data. Mm-hmm. What I found that is that employee engagement is a set of questions that people answer that sometimes those questions are not even in their minds. So give an example. Are you happy with your salary? Is a question, and then some people that aren't even thinking about that. Of course, nobody's happy with the salary, and that goes calculated into the employee engagement component of that. Yeah. So I think that there is I wish there was another way to measure what they want to measure, but employee engagement hasn't gone up or down over years. It's statistically sound because it's average. You see what I'm saying? It's simply average. So what I think that it is that the one thing that I learned about employee engagement, if you want to talk about the engagement, how people are doing things for the organization, is that the biggest driver of engagement is the relationship that people have with their managers. If you have a great manager, you're going to be engaged. If you got a great team, you're going to be engaged. So for me, I think that if we're talking about employee engagement, real employee engagement, which is measured in two ways: the pride that a person has for the organization and the additional effort, the extra effort that they do because they're feeling proud. Those are the only two things that if I am so proud of the organization and I do extra things, I'm an engaged employee. But that's not what most employee engagements ask. They ask things that are not related to the effort or to the affiliation or the pride that people have over an employee. So going back to your question, what can one person do to elevate employee engagement is to, number one, I think that the key here is to get closer to your employees, because that is the biggest source of employee engagement. That is the relationship that people have with their direct managers.
I fully agree. And the notion of effort that you just mentioned now, and connecting the dots with the kids. As I was reading about children's psychology, and I discovered that as parents, the best thing is never to praise their results, but rather to praise their efforts. And when you're looking in an organizational settings, very often it's so centered around praising results. We met this timeline, we achieved this KPI, and we often, sometimes some leaders, and I'm not saying that everyone does this, but there's some great leaders out there that actually do pay attention to the level of effort that people have put into a project. Even if that project fails and maybe we did not necessarily reach that KPI, there's so many lessons to be learned.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that's also what we need to bring in more within organizations, is let's also not just exclusively focus on the KPIs and the end results, but also let's look at the collective efforts or the individual efforts that people are putting in to progress and to learn and to grow together to create a thriving business, but also create thriving humans in the process as well.
That is correct. Yeah.
So this brings me to the question about resilience within enterprises. What do you believe is the responsibilities that leaders have to elevate the resilience of their people?
So let's make a difference right now. Resilience enterprise versus individual resilience. There is no such thing as resilience enterprise, in my view, because resilience is a living thing that happens to humans. So the organization is as resilient as the people that operate on that component. To your point, if you think about the CEO and the people that are actually running the organization, what can they do is, I think that number one is model the way. is model the way. That's number one. Number two, I think that we need to also make sure that we could reframe the relationship with failing. To your point earlier, there are some failures that are incredible for the organizational learnings. So I think that the key here is not to focus on the outcome, but in the journey. So that's number two. Number three, I think that the other component that I think that people can do to create resilient organizations is to provide a level of psychological safety so people can experiment and adapt, because that's the key. When you want to adapt, you want to experiment. I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this one, and then you can move forward. So in my book, I mentioned a few things that leaders can do in order to create resilient teams, which also translate into resilient organizations. But I think the number one is model the way.
I fully agree. And if we look now at society at large, what do you believe we should do collectively to bring more joy into our world?
I think that, I facilitate a class at Stanford University. They call it Touchy-Feely, which is one of the most iconic classes of the Stanford University School of Business. And the premise of the class is gaining influence by connecting with others that are different from us. And I think that is the one thing that we have and that I wish we could do more of, is to reach out people that are different from us, because we can learn different perspective. We can see ourselves through their eyes. And man, if we can get talking, the world will be a different place. But what is happening now is, is trying to hide behind our phones and hide behind, computers, or hide behind a book, when we should just talk to each other.
Fully agree. And Luis, do you have any final words of wisdom that you may wish to share with our audience as it relates to resilience and joy?
If anything that people can get from the book or from this podcast is the following: that we already have everything that we need to get the first step. We don't need absolutely anything else but just making a commitment to do whatever we want to. Making that commitment, you're already on your way up.
Luis, it's been an immense pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much, and keep shining.
Andrea, thank you so much for having me. I'm really appreciative, and I'm very grateful and impressed with your mission of helping people find joy. I think that is so altruistic and so awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.